Welcome to season 1 of the Resilient Dad Show. When I became a single dad and had to navigate social parenting issues and the complexity of the family legal system, I felt confused and alone with nowhere to turn. That's why I've created the Resilient Dad Show, a place that I so badly needed and wish had been available during the grueling and challenging times of working through my own experience. This show will feature industry experts in mental health, social services, and personal development, along with resilient dad role models whose stories of overcoming the challenges of co-parenting will create a new vision for the life you and your kids deserve. If you have any questions or want to suggest a future guest on the show, please visit resilientdad.fm for more information. Welcome to the Resilient Dad Show, guys. And I'm your host, Pat DiDomenico. And today we have a special guest, Nick McGowan. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pat. I'm excited to be here, man. I'm glad that you were on my show, and now we're able to get into the resilient dad side of life on your show.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure being on your show and getting to know you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation and going deeper into both our stories and yours of having the experience of having to grow up in a different circumstance as a child, and some of your own adult experiences with some of the challenges that you've faced. So could you share a bit where the story all started?
Sure. I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, but I'm going to let the cat out of the bag right now. I am not a dad. So if you want to stop listening, don't. Just keep going. Keep listening to this episode. There's more to it. But Pat and I talked about that. After we had a conversation, he was like, hey, man, I'd like to have you on the show. I instantly said, well, that's cool. I don't have any kids, because I figured resilient dad. But there's a lot that we can get into about our own fathers, our own relationships with our fathers, our relationships with other people's kids, like our nieces, nephews, whatever that looks like, or even just seeing some kid in the grocery store. There are times there are kids screaming, and honestly, there are times where I hear that and I just think birth control, like for me, where I'm not going to have that kid and I don't want that kid screaming. Yeah. But then it is interesting to be able to see how a parent, father or mother, kind of interacts with their kids. How I grew up was a certain way in the Northeast of the U.S. in Philadelphia, where everybody was it just seemed like they were constantly agitated, or at least that's how it was in my circle. They're all just like, just kind of pissy about things at times. And I remember being that little kid in the grocery store yelling or screaming or whatever. And my mom would do the same thing back. My dad would handle things differently. So when I thought about your show, Resilient Dad, though I'm not a dad, I've got one of those. And for those that don't have a resilient dad or somebody that's a father figure to them, I can almost guarantee that you have somebody in your life that is, even if it's somebody that you've worked with or a boss or something like that that you can look up to. So take a little bit of a step back. I'm a podcast host. I host the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show. I'm kind of a tech geek. I work with a 3D company, run the consumer products division for them, doing sales. Outside of that, I've got a men's group that I'm partnered with. It's the Powerhouse Men's Brotherhood. And I teach people how to set up their podcast and how to run it and how to go through with it. And all the tips and tricks and honestly, all the shit that I've learned over the course of my time doing it. But man, I've had so many conversations with people. Again, thinking about coming on the show, had conversations with different fathers or people that talk about their fathers on the show. Because on our show, we unpack the traumas and the stories that have shaped somebody on their life towards self-mastery. And for the most part, I really believe that a lot of the shit that we go through and a lot of the trauma comes from our childhood.
Absolutely.
It all stems back from that. That's where we're starting to suck in the different information. When you think of I think of driving to the store. You can basically hop in your car, get to the store, buy whatever you're going to buy, come back, look down at all the stuff in your hand and go, what? How did I get all of this? Oh, okay, I went to the store. Then you don't really think about it sometimes. Now, you shouldn't be on autopilot like that constantly, where you're just like, what the fuck did I do? Why am I bloody? That's not ever a good thing. But if you're in that spot where you're able to just subconsciously go through a routine. It's because you've done something over and over and over and over again. And we lose that sense of newness, that sense of, I wonder what this thing's about. I often think about looking at things like the innocence of a child and coming into a situation and going, what is this thing? What do you do? What are you about? What do you like? What's that over there? What does that smell like? You know what I mean? Like when you think of little kids where they're just like, I wonder what this tastes like. And you're like, don't fucking taste that. They're like, but I need to try it. And they toss it back and you're like, get it out. No, we forget to do some of that as we get older, to just try things. And we get so jaded by stuff where we just allow our routines to get into the way that we look at stuff and not ever really take a step outside of that. And I do think a lot of that comes from not only us getting into life and in certain ways getting kind of beaten up by life or jaded by life, but I think we look at things based on how our parents looked at things. I grew up in a way where I think often about the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book. I had a situation growing up where I had a rich dad and sort of a poor mom. I don't like to paint her in that picture of being poor, but she worked a handful of jobs, made okay money, but nothing crazy. We lived in different apartments, from apartment sort of deal. But with my dad, he was an entrepreneur. His wife was a CFO of a big company, and they made good money and had a lifestyle that went along with that. But I realized early on that a lot of it was mindset. My mom, love her to pieces, but she'd bitch and complain about things because she was hurting and didn't understand how to process through all of that.
Yeah.
My dad, on the other hand, he would bitch about things, but there would be times where he would internalize stuff and just go almost like that tough manly thing that a lot of men thought they needed to do, where they go, fuck it, I'm going to put dirt on it and get back out there and go do it and not deal with the bullshit and the trauma. So they both basically did the same thing where they clammed up. I learned from that at a young age to go, all right, cool. Well, that's how you do it. You yell at people about things. And then when you don't want to deal with it, you just say, fuck it, I'm done. And you close down. Clearly, that's not the right way to go about it. So over the course of time, I've learned how to peel myself out of that, but also understand when I'm getting to that point and what is happening and how you can get to that point and what you can do about it. But that all boils down to awareness. So I know I've wrapped up a lot of stuff all in kind of this intro, but that's where my thoughts were, honestly, hopping on the show.
Yeah.
I didn't have it. I'm not a dad, but I've got a dad and I know how that all looks. And I've been able to unpack a lot from dads that have come on my show.
Yeah. Thanks for unraveling that and understanding pattern recognition and the ability to be aware that our behavior patterns are conditioned from such a young age. Programming, it's like you don't think about how to tie your shoes anymore. Like when we're a little kid, we're struggling to tie our shoelaces, but now it's second nature. You don't think about how do you brush your teeth or, how do you eat food? We just do it that often, and we can either form good patterns or bad patterns. And, it's like monkey see, monkey do. I know my kids, I'm very conscious and aware that, what am I doing that they're seeing? Is that something that, that is a good example for them? Or is it, an example where it's like, I catch myself. There's times where I've been frustrated and I'm like, oh, wow, calm down. This is not the way to react to the situation. And it might have nothing to do with them at all, but it might be dealing with, a technology issue. Like the internet's not working. And do I yell and scream and get frustrated or do I show them that in terms of, you work through challenges and problems and you and life goes on. But it's the examples that our parents, give us that, I guess, start our way of life and our beliefs and the values that are formed. And then eventually as adults, we start to form our own, and we can have some conflicting values and beliefs. Like you said, your mum and dad had very different, mindsets and I'm sure their upbringings were very different, and that's what also caused those differences. So when did you realize, at what part of life did you realize that these patterns were occurring and that yelling and trying to rub some dirt on it wasn't necessarily the best way moving forward?
It's a good question, Pat. I think back to basically middle school. When I was in, I don't know, 7th, 8th grade, I really started to feel different from the group that I was in, and not like I was a part of things. And now I get it as like a tween or a teenager. You're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what I want to do. I don't know who I am. Like everybody kind of goes through that stuff. But there was a couple moments where I really felt like I didn't belong with the family that I was with when I was younger, because at that point I was living primarily with my dad. So it was my dad and his wife, and they had 2 other kids. I was the first one. I'm the oldest. So even with my stepmom, I was still her first. Like she learned shit with me. It's like, you do this. And then by the second one, it's like, maybe you do it a little differently. By the third one, she's like, you fucking don't listen to the other 2. This is how you do this thing. So going through that sort of stuff with them. And then when they had their 2 other kids and their kids were a bit older, by the time I was 13, now I'm 8 years older than my sister and 5 years older than my brother. So there's a healthy difference in ages there, but not far enough that, it's crazy. The 8-year gap was tough when I was young, but now my sister just turned 30, literally today, the 21st of September, as we're recording this.
Happy birthday to sister.
So we have a different, thanks, man. We have a different relationship now, because obviously we've grown up and things are different. But when I was in middle school, I felt like I wasn't a part of that, because I didn't know what I was a part of, just like most kids at that point. Right. But that kind of stepped me out of, well, what do I do differently? How do I do things differently? And that actually drove me to my mom's house at that point, which I remember thinking like, all right, screw you, dad and stepmom. And, I'm not part of this family as like a spicy little fucking kid. And I was like, I'm out of here. And I went to my mom's. And I remember thinking at my mom's, what the fuck did I do? Why am I here? What am I doing? Well, I went from this big house with this pool and, great meals and all this stuff. And now I'm in like this tiny ass apartment. And it felt like in certain ways that my mom was kind of like an older sister that our mom died or something, and she just had to take care of me. Like the love was there. She's like, I love you, but fuck, you're kind of a pain in the ass sometimes, and I don't want to deal with this. That was how it felt at that point. Now I know that she was trying to figure it out. She was a young single mom trying to figure shit out with some basically shitty little kid at different times, Yeah. But that was the moment when I was maybe 13 years old that I could really feel like things started to shift a bit, and I started to look at things differently. Now, I've always looked at things from like a third party perspective, but when I was a little kid, I didn't really understand that. Like even the conversation you and I are having, it's relatively easy for me to kind of pop out of where we're at and look at it from like a wallflower's perspective, or somebody that's sitting over here thinking about both of us going, all right, well, here's Pat and there's Nick, and this is what I know of this guy, this is what I know of this guy. It was kind of easy for me to always look at stuff like that. So I started to really become aware of that right around that time, again, like 8th grade-ish, where I started to look at things and look at it from a third or even an outsider's perspective. But I didn't understand how to use that, or like what to do with the information. It almost just like confused me even more. And then when I was with my mom or staying at my mom's house, it was basically throughout all of high school. And I kind of just did things on my own. Again, she had a handful of jobs, worked constantly. She would show up randomly back at the house when I think she'd be at work, and I'd have a bunch of friends over and everybody be like, oh my God, go, and run out, that sort of deal. But for the most part, like I just kind of did things on my own and learned on my own and went and got my ass kicked in different situations. Not as much physically, but more figuratively, and like going to try things out and test things and trying to figure out, do I have game as a 13 or 14-year-old? And at one point realizing that I did, and it kind of got me into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And getting connected with different friends got me into a lot of trouble. Now, as a 38-year-old man, looking back at that situation, I didn't have my dad at that point. My dad and I didn't talk for 5 years, 6 years, something like that. There was a couple little moments in high school where maybe we talked about something, but it was nothing to write home about. So we basically had no relationship throughout what are pretty much formative years throughout high school. Like, I really wish that I had that now. Now, I'm not saying I regret, but it would have been nice to be able to go, yo, Pop, I'm in this weird situation with my group of friends, or I want to ask this girl out, but I'm too afraid to do it, or whatever. I didn't have that. And I didn't have that with my mom either.
Right.
We talk about different things at times, but she was too busy working and trying to keep the roof above our heads. And I didn't fully understand that as a kid. Like now I thank her for it. Where I'm like, Mom, sorry, I was a douchebag. I really was. And I know that you were doing everything you could, but there were things that we probably could have talked about, and communication is key with that. So
Yeah.
I think, again, looking back at the situation, that pivotal moment right before high school, that was when I started to really look at things as, again, that third party perspective, looking at it and looking at the situation. But again, I wasn't really equipped and didn't know how to handle that or to dive into it. Like once you're aware of something and you go, cool, I know it's here, you can either run from it or you can run into it. Like if you run from it and you go, I don't want to deal with this thing, like everybody does with something at some point.
Yeah.
And then there's something else that you go, oh, I want to dive into this thing, like a hobby or something that you're passionate about. I didn't understand how to utilize those tools to do it in the sense where I could really jump into my mind and start to unpack the stuff and go through the traumas. Instead, I basically drove that energy into playing music, not really going to high school, like doing things outside of that.
Yeah.
And just trying to, figure my way out throughout life. So after high school, I'd gone through a lot of stuff, but there was a moment, maybe a year after high school, I was in this band that we were getting looked at by these big labels, and we were all kids. So basically everybody was going to go to college if we didn't get signed. We didn't get signed, and most of the band, like 75% of the band, just went off to college. And I wasn't going to go to college because I remember being in high school. One of my counselors I talked to, they're like, we can get you into art school or music school, but you're not going to make any money. So what do you want to do? I was like, well, neither of those then, and wrote off college.
Yeah.
So when that band that I was in didn't get signed and most of the members went off to college, I was like, oh shit, what am I going to do? And I went back home basically and didn't know what I wanted to do. That led me to having a terrible job that wasn't going to get me anywhere. That ultimately led me to having, the easiest way to put it is I overdosed on heroin. That's the quick and dirty version of that. Not knowing what I was going to do and not having anybody to really talk to or talk about the problems that I have. I think if I had my dad in those years, I maybe could have talked to him and been like, hey man, this is what I'm feeling right now. And I don't know what to do with this, or how do I go about it? So I looked for that healing in kind of the wrong areas.
Yeah.
After I overdosed and I didn't die, I remember thinking, one, all right, God, you must want me here for something. If not, I would have been dead 15 minutes ago. And then the other thing was, all right, well, what do I do with this now? And that's when I think I started to really look at the situation again from an outsider's perspective and start to piece together some of the information that I already had and kind of that innate ability to be able to unpack these things, but still didn't really have the tools to do it.
Yeah.
So what I'm realizing now, almost at 40, is that a lot of this really needed to compound on each other. The information and the experiences, and then the tools that I learned. Because in my early 20s, that's when I got into personal development, Tony Robbins, and T.R. Vecker, and Zig Ziglar, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then I remember being able to actually utilize those things because I was able to conceptualize them and understand. Like, think about it. If you need to build a house or something, but you don't have any tools, you're like, what the fuck? Am I going to slam my head into these nails to put the wood up? Like, that doesn't make any sense. So then I started to be able to have these tools that could help, that were actually efficient tools. And by getting into that, that led me into different conversations and, companies that I worked with and different people that I met. So it was interesting to see, again, looking back now, how those experiences and those things and the way that I look at it allowed for other opportunities to come up, but it all had to happen that way. Like, it all needed to compound on each other. But there was that hole in high school, that parental hole that I didn't have. I didn't have my dad around. And honestly, man, that was me. That was me just being a shitty kid, not knowing how to handle things or how to communicate. And I had struggled with communication ever since I was a little kid. I even went to speech therapy classes and things of that sort when I was little. Wow. And I appreciate that my mom and dad put me through that. But I had really hard time communicating with people. And I think that's what led me to music, where it's easier for me to express a feeling through music than it is to say the words of the feeling. And I had to learn how to actually communicate. And it started with me, like, the fuck am I going through? I don't know. Okay. And then after so many times going, I don't know, I was like, well, you gotta figure it out. No one's going to come save you. You need to do this,
Absolutely. So having the absence, of your father during those teenage years, which I was in a similar situation, because the second time that my parents had actually separated and divorced, I was 13. Yeah, it was my 13th birthday. So, yeah, it's definitely a birthday I'll never forget. But, I think I spoke to my dad maybe once or twice until I was 23. First time I saw my dad was the day that my brother passed away, which, was a hard experience in itself, losing your brother, then having to see your dad. And, another time was when I received a letter from him. Funnily enough, it was dated on my birthday, but it didn't realize it was my birthday, which is something that, back then you don't understand the traumas that people are experiencing or what they've gone through in their own lives. My dad struggled with, alcoholism. That's what he eventually passed away with having liver failure. But he had a lot of his own traumas growing up. And now I can understand where I have a lot more empathy for him and understanding of his own upbringing and his behavior patterns and why he reacted the way that he did. He did the best that he could based on what he knew. And so what were some of the things that you've maybe recognized in your dad's, upbringing that caused him to parent the way that he did, and, needing to be tough and strong and not show those emotions as much?
So I think some of that comes from his parents, but I think a lot more of it came from an experience that he had. So growing up, my grandparents are in their 80s, late 80s. So they were born in the 30s.
Right.
So my dad was born in late 50s. I think 59 is when he was born. So think he's basically growing up in the 60s and 70s. I was born in the mid 80s. So he was growing up 60s and 70s. So his parents at that point were still of the mindset of the basically 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Right.
So there was a lot of traditional things that the parents did, even specifically church-wise. They went to church X amount of times per week. They had Sunday school. They did all these things. And his parents had traditions that were basically just handed down to them and forced upon them in certain ways that went along with the church or the way that they looked at things. So like what you're saying, you would hope that everybody's doing what they can. and that people aren't just walking around being like, man, how can I be a complete fucking douchebag to people today? Now, granted, there are some people that are like that, and some of those people are parents. But for the most part, everybody's doing what they feel like they can be doing, at least the best that they can. So my dad's parents felt the same way. There are certain things that my dad grew up with that I know he cherishes and really appreciates because it helped him become the man that he is. But there was also stuff that he didn't understand. Like something that my dad had talked about for years was he wasn't able to go play or do anything on Sundays because that was the Lord's Day and you didn't do things on Sundays. My grandfather, maybe about 5-6 years ago, reread whatever verse that was in the Bible and called up my dad and was like, hey, I'm sorry. I think I misread that or I misunderstood that at that point. It didn't mean to not go do things you want to do. It just you don't have to work on that day. You can have that day of rest, which you can do what you want. But there was a disconnect where my dad was like, I don't understand why I can't do these things. And I don't like these traditions. And his dad just trying to be the best that he can and going, hey, this is what I believe. And this is what we'll do as a family. But then he was able to kind of man up and years later say, hey, I misunderstood that. I'm sorry. And that helped a bit. But my dad grew up in a way where I think they had a great childhood, like an absolute wonderful childhood. Parents were loving, nothing crazy really happened. And my grandfather worked for Sunco at that time, like years and years and years ago, and was able to get my dad a job on ships. And at, I think, 17 to 21 or 22, he was sailing all over the place and had to grow up quickly. So he had this great life. And then when he was right out of high school, was basically thrown into crazy choppy waters and you could die at any moment and had to pretty much man up right then and there. So I think that shifted and changed him. Like, honestly, man, we had a conversation 2 weeks ago. I was just up to see them and hanging out. When I'm up there, I stay with my dad. So we're sitting out, having some bourbon, talking about things and getting into different life topics. And we talked about this specifically, where he was like, if I didn't have those years, it would have looked wildly different because he had to grow up and he had to change. And I think because it happened so quickly, he looked at the difference in how his parents were and just propelled him away, almost like kicking back off of the side of a mountain. He was just like, nope. So his parenting style had some of what his parents were, but then it was really free form of how he wanted to go about it. He even tells me that he believes that he and his ex-wife were basically together just to have kids. Like, they had a great relationship and it ran its course and all that stuff. But he was like, I feel like we were put together to have you guys, me, my brother and sister, and work through all this stuff, deal with the craziness of my mom and that whole dynamic. But that, every single ounce of that shaped how he was a parent. On the other side of that, with my mom, she was the youngest of 7. And her dad died 2 days after her 14th birthday.
Wow.
So she, right off the bat, basically just has daddy's issues because she lost the man who was the man in her life. And then going from there into different, relationships as she got older. By the time she had me, when she was 22, she was still learning how to grow and how to be a person, and had all of that shit behind her. And the trauma, so that didn't help when my dad and her didn't work out. So there was a distance from them because of that, which stemmed back to the dad situation. So it's interesting looking at it now. And again, I've got a great relationship with both of them. They're both basically, they're more like brother and sister to me. But they have moments, obviously, where I totally respect both of their opinions on things. And there are other moments where I don't. And I straight up tell them, like, nope, I don't believe it because here's why. Yeah. And we have a great relationship where they'll listen or tell me to fuck off and be like, well, here's why. And then we'll go back and forth with it. But it's great to have that now. But I understand that they had those things that happened to them. and being able to have the conversations now to talk through that stuff, and for them to be able to talk with me about how they can reflect on it, because that's not normally what people bring up, and it's not normal, bar or hanging out conversation. But when we get into that sort of stuff, it's interesting to hear their perspective of where they're at now in their 60s, looking back and going, yeah, well, I thought this was the best decision, but it wasn't. Or I thought this was a terrible decision, but it clearly was a great one, or whatever. And then being able to have that retrospective view of it. But it's interesting how we all learn from our parents what to do and what not to do. It's really up to us to figure out, does it make sense? And without turning this thing completely upside down, that's really how we should live life. Like, even if you said something to me now, Pat, if you were like, well, whatever, you could make up whatever bullshit you want, and I didn't believe it, be like, okay, I'm not just going to go with it and be like, well, Pat said it, so this is how this works. I would question it. And I think for the most part, people need to do that. I appreciate my parents because at the core of who they are, they do that. And maybe it's a genetic thing that I've done that.
Yeah.
Or it might be how I saw them do different things. But for the most part, I believe it's just innate, where they're inquisitive people. They're the Y-type people. But that's something I've learned from them over the course of time, and that I, again, can look back at now and have conversations with them about it. And it's kind of wild to do that, where they're further along in their story, where in some ways they're not going to change certain ways, or certain things. But I'm in that kind of sweet spot where I can see from their perspective and being older, and I can see from my younger perspective, where I can jump back into that 7-year-old's body and look from that perspective of, I don't understand what's going on, or why am I in pain right now, and not understanding how to actually go through it and communicate it. But to wrap it all up, I mean, this all gets back to communication, and you've got to start internally. As you ask yourself questions, you can't just write it off and be like, well, why don't I feel right about this? I don't know. You just move along. It makes zero sense, but we do it often, where we'll start to ask ourselves something because we feel weird about a situation. Then we'll just write it off because, pick whatever bullshit excuse you want. You got to go pick up the kids. You got to go to the bathroom. You got to do something other than do the work on the thing.
Yeah.
But sometimes it takes you doing the work and being communicative with yourself before you can communicate with anybody else about it.
And that event of you overdosing on heroin, and obviously, I'm assuming that there was sort of during that period that you had the absence of your father in your life. What were maybe some of the things that you sort of found that contributed to you going down that path of possibly feeling like you needed something externally for you to feel fulfilled or satisfied?
Well, Pat, I think some of it was a sense of belonging. Like, I was looking for a place to belong. I had titled myself as a creative, as an artist and a musician in high school. And then I was working on a path to becoming what I thought I wanted to be, a big rock star. And we were going to get signed with this band, and all of my fucking eggs were in one basket at that point.
Right.
And then when that didn't happen, because I had all of my eggs in that one basket and I wasn't equipped to go, one, maybe I shouldn't have had all my eggs in that basket. And two, what the fuck did I do that? And three, what do I do now? I wasn't equipped with that. So I had no idea what was going on. There was another thing that kind of made me crumble a little bit. Then my girlfriend throughout high school, which looking back was just a terrible situation. She had broken up with me for, the 480th time. And that along with not having a great job, I just felt like the world was caving in because I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand how to handle it. I can kind of think of myself in that sense, like maybe I was like a level 2 type person dealing with like a level 3 type problem where I was like, what do I do? Heroin's probably a little bit more than a level 3. Yes, I understand. But I I think I was looking for belonging and some sort of comfort. Like, think about those times when you're like, man, today's been a rough day, or it's been a rough week, or whatever. And you just want some sort of what I call like a happy, where you're like, man, I want to go get ice cream, or I want to go sit in the pool for a little bit, or I want to go play video games for a little bit, or whatever it may be. I think in certain ways I was looking for something that was like that. And then because I was in a negative space, negativity came to me, and it came to me hard. Like, even with heroin, man, I didn't even know it was heroin. I get it. Kind of a dumbass situation. Had no idea what it was. There was a situation with a guy that I met through a girl that I was friends with in the neighborhood, literally like a couple blocks away from my house growing up. And at one point, he's like, man, can you drive me down to the city? I want to go pick some things up. He's like, I'll give you gas money. And I smoked cigarettes at that point. So he's like, I'll give you a couple smokes. I'm like, oh, sure. Gas money and smokes. Game on. Let's do this. Hop in the car. And we did that a number of times. And he would give me gas money or buy me a pack of smokes or whatever. And at one point, I was like, what the fuck are you getting? Like, what are you picking up, or what are you doing at these shady houses? And he was like, oh, it's nothing. It's no big deal. And then a couple weeks go by, and another handful of these trips. And he was like, oh, I'm getting angel dust. Do you want some? And I remember being in high school and hearing about angel dust and automatically thinking, well, it's definitely not as bad as heroin, because heroin's like top of the bad list. You know, like that's the shit you don't want to go near. This is kind of like, I don't know, bullshit. So I was like, no, man, I'm good. Whatever. A couple of weeks go by and I'm just getting in more of a worse spot mentally. And at one point I was like, yeah, let's do it. And I didn't, inject it because I always thought that was what heroin was. And I was like, no, if somebody comes at me with a needle, I'd be like, no. I know that's on the bad list. I'm not going to do that thing. And didn't end up doing that. I ended up smoking or snorting it different times. But at one point I overdosed and I did 3 bags, one up one nostril, one up another, and one up the, back to the right nostril again. And then just started to black out. It was actually white out. Like everything just became white, and I couldn't move, couldn't see outside of the white. And at one point, one of the people I was with, the woman that was there, saw that I was basically dying and overdosing, and took me into the bathroom and beat the shit out of me until I threw up. And I'm glad she did. And that was one of those moments where I remember walking home a couple blocks away, lighting up a cigarette and being like, what in the fuck just happened? Like, what? And looking up and being like, all right, God, big curveball there. Now what? What do you want me to do? What am I supposed to do? Yeah. And I can look at that situation from that moment before and think, man, there were a lot of bad decisions that got me to that point. A lot of bad decisions over and over and over, where if my dad was around, probably would have smelled that shit out and been like, yo, dude, what are you doing? I don't know, Pop, I'm taking this guy for these things, blah, blah, blah. And he would have been like, no, we're not going to do that. And talk me out of it, or, help me understand. He's always been good at, look, you can do whatever you want. And if you feel you got to learn that way, you go learn that way. But let me tell you a story of how I learned it. And if you don't want to listen to the story and you don't want to take it, then fucking go at it. Let me know when you're done. Like that sort of deal. Yeah. So I feel like even if I had that conversation, that would have shifted things differently, even 1% different, or 2% different. And I may not have gone down that path. I may have. I don't know. Either way, I did. And being able to look at that and think back from that moment when I overdosed backwards, again, I can look at those situations, go, man, things could have been a little different. But then a couple weeks, maybe 2 weeks after I overdosed, I told my mom. And I still remember it. We were in our house. There were, I don't know, like 15 steps upstairs. And she was about ready to head out the front door. And I was like, hey, Mom, before you go, I just need you to know I overdosed on heroin about 2 weeks ago. I'm all right, though. I'm good. And she was like, what? And what she said to me after that was, what do I tell you every time you go out? Don't do something dumb. And what did you do? Something dumb. All right. Don't fucking do it again. I got to go to work. I'm like, okay. That was the extent of that conversation. And I remember thinking back on that conversation like 10 minutes after that, an hour after that, now years later, and being able to think like, what the fuck? That's all she said to me? Now, I've had a conversation with my mom about it. And she was like, what the fuck did you want me to say to you? You just told me that you overdosed on heroin. I was like, yeah, all right. Touche. So being able to understand both those perspectives is a big thing. But I didn't feel like I could talk to her about that stuff as I was going through it.
Yeah.
Because there was just aggravation and stuff that was already happening. But again, now looking at it and having the conversation with her, because I clearly didn't die at that point, or I may have died, but I'm not dead right now. You're not talking to a ghost. She, we can kind of, I don't want to say laugh about it, but we can have an understanding that all is okay at this point.
Yeah.
And I don't have that understanding with her that if dad was in my life at that point, maybe that wouldn't have happened. And I don't have that conversation with her directly because the way that I think she would interpret that would be that she would see that she wasn't enough. And I don't ever want to make her feel like she wasn't enough, because I truly believe now in this moment that she did everything she could. She tried to be enough and more, but she did the best that she could,
And from that event, is that where you reconnected more with your father? Or when was the moment where
that would have been a little wild? Like, yo, Pop, I overdosed on heroin. Welcome back. No, that's not how it worked. No, I think it was, there were a couple times where we talked through high school, like a couple times. He also had a situation where he had a triple bypass surgery. And I talked to him at that point, like I wasn't going to be a complete douchebag. Like, my dad just had crazy surgery. There were a couple moments that we talked through things. So we had a semi-relationship. But it was probably around, I don't know, 19-ish, 20, like a little after I had overdosed, maybe 6 months, a year after that. I'd end up getting into a network marketing company. I didn't know what network marketing company was. I didn't know the good, bad, ugly. I didn't know any of that stuff. I just knew I needed something different. And it was a personal development adventure in a sense, because that got me started on the path of, well, what do you want to do? How do you want to do this stuff? Who can you learn from? That sort of deal, which led me basically back toward being able to have a conversation with my dad. And then at one point, I remember a buddy of mine and I, we had a company, we were working at a car dealership and had a management consultant company in the auto industry. He and I were kind of driving around the old neighborhood because he grew up a town away from me. And at one point we were near my dad's house, maybe a couple blocks away. And I was like, yo, dude, just drive down the street. I want to see my dad's old place. And I saw my dad and dog on the corner. And I was like, yo, how you doing? How's life? He's like, good, man. How are you? Like, where the fuck have you been, basically? And that, I think that was probably the moment that we restarted and had more conversation. After that, I think my buddy and I went up to the house, hung out for a couple minutes, whatever, and then left and then kind of back and forth. But in my early 20s, there were summers that I would go back to my dad's house. Like I would live at different places throughout the year and then basically just kind of end up at my dad's for the summer. We had a second house that's on the property. It's a garage, but we redid it to be an apartment. Yeah. And I was the first tenant that was in there and we're kind of building it up. So over like a couple of summers, I would go back. Plus his house is the place to be in the summer. Huge pool, like 15 different grills and barbecues and huge deck and a pool house and all this stuff. But there were many moments early on, like I guess, again, 19, 20-ish, 21, where we just have conversations about some things and start to kind of rekindle a relationship and a friendship. And that was, I'm 38 now. So in some ways that was sort of a lifetime ago. Yeah. And I can think back to those years where I didn't have my dad or my brother and sister around. And those again were those formative years, but I felt like I kind of went into a desert for 5 or 6 years and came back and was like, I've been through some crazy shit. Love you. Can I come back and let's talk about things? But it's interesting because I feel like now having the relationship with my dad and the relationship with my mom, I feel like they understand that I don't need them. Like as kids need their parents for, X amount of years. I don't need them, but I choose to have them in my life. And there's that mutual respect from them as well. Like they don't need me to be around because they're fucking grown ass adults and they can do what they want. They choose to also be in my life. And I appreciate that that's there now, where I've got some friends that still have to do things with their family because that's just how they do things. Like every holiday or whatever, it's just like, it's tradition. It's how it works. That's not how it works with me because we've had kind of a different path,
Yeah. And how did the relationship that you saw between your parents, how did that guide you with your own relationships, with in terms of, like you were saying, you had a girlfriend that you broke up with 48,000 times. I'm assuming there was a potentially codependency situation there. And then,
that's what it was.
Moving forward, how did, because I guess you're not having the example of what a relationship's meant to look like. I know for me, from a very young age, if I didn't have someone there as, in terms of as a partner or a girlfriend from a young age up until, I was probably maybe 29, the first time in my life where I actually probably had a good 6 months where I didn't have someone in my life. And I was like, wow, this is different. This is interesting. But like, how did that situation?
I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar for a quick second. I appreciate you, man. You're asking great questions and you're asking real questions. And I can tell that for the audience, this isn't scripted. It's not like Pat sent me a list of fucking questions and he's like, answer these or else. You're actually asking things that you're feeling. And these are great questions. So thank you for that question. And thank you for just being you, man. Appreciate that. I think about the shit that I went through with the girls in high school because I was looking for love and not knowing what I really wanted. And I thought love was equivalent to sex or, at least the chase of like running after women. So I was not very nice when I was in high school. I wasn't a good boyfriend. I probably wasn't really a good friend because I didn't feel right in myself, and there were a lot of relationships and friendships that I probably didn't do the best with. And it helped me learn. It helped me grow in certain ways. Again, looking at it from a third party perspective, looking back at it. But I do think that having the examples that I had, or at least what I thought were the examples, wasn't healthy. And I didn't understand how to have a healthy relationship. So I didn't really have a healthy relationship until my late 20s. Everything before that, I had some relationships that lasted 6 months, a year, 2 years, something like that. But for the most part, I didn't have any crazy long-term relationships. And they weren't super healthy. Again, looking back, I can look at things and go, I learned this in this relationship. I learned this in this relationship or what have you. But it wasn't until my late 20s when I married one of my old partner's daughters. I had a social media and digital marketing agency with a buddy who was a trainer in one of my previous companies. He and I stayed in contact. He was a bit older, I don't know, 20 years older, something like that, and had a couple of daughters. So I knew their family and all. Long story short, she and I hit it off and I started a company with them and went down a journey of running an agency with my in-laws and trying to be a husband. And I remember probably our first fight, like our actual fight where you're like, I want to fucking yell and scream and kick and, all those things. Like it's an actual fight, like one of those sort of deals. And I remember I got fucking loud. And I learned that from my mom and dad, where even as a kid, like I remember the three of us, my brother, sister, and I, we'd be too loud or whatever would be happening. And my dad would do one of those like, hey, and the world would stop. Cause you'd just be like, oh shit, Pop just yelled. Like if we make another peep, dude's going to pop us in the back of the head or something, you know? So I remember learning that as a young age, like, oh, that's how you stop people. You fucking yell real loud and you stare at them like you're going to kill them. Yeah. Or on the other side, my mom would throw things at me and we would get in arguments and just yell and scream at each other. And I don't think parents should be that like that, but that's kind of how they grew up in their households growing up. Like if their parents needed to stop them, they would yell or scream or throw something or whatever. Again, my mom was the baby of 7. So imagine the shit that she had seen and gone through and all that sort of stuff. So I think of those, but I remember having that first argument with my ex-wife and yelling about something or like getting loud. And she was like, no, that doesn't work for me. In fact, I shut down when you do that. And she was just so polite about it. Like I remember being like, but really, like if I yell a little bit, she's like, nope, not even a little bit. And I was like, oh, well, why are we calm now? She's like, because I've calmed you down. I'm like, well, fuck. But so I shouldn't yell and scream and throw things? She's like, no, in fact, you shouldn't do that at all, ever. And I was like, oh, fuck. Okay. But I remember thinking in that moment, like, I'm still fucking mad at you. But now I'm like, this is a pivotal moment where I was like, oh shit. Okay, cool. Because all the other relationships before that, we all kind of grew up in a similar way where like if we ever got into an argument, like you would yell and scream, then you'd make up in certain ways. You know what I mean? So I always thought that was kind of how it needed to work. But I remember in that moment being like, oh shit, well, she shuts down. That's no good. I don't want her to shut down. We need to fix this thing. So how do I do this if I can't yell and throw things? I guess I need to communicate. Here we go. Back to communication. I was like, oh, fuck. Well, I need to communicate with myself first and go, well, what's actually happening? But I think that moment shifted the way that not only she and I worked through problems and things of that sort, but also got me to start to really head deeper down that path of getting into my childhood trauma and what had happened, what made me up to that point, and figuring that out every single day and looking at those things. So even in that relationship with my marriage, man, there were things that I just gave up on. I set to the side. I honestly, and I say this sort of jokingly, but I guess fully intentional. I didn't know how to husband. I didn't fucking know. I didn't know how to be the best me. And I was still learning. Yeah. So there are other moments where like we would argue about things or whatever. And that was one of those moments where I'm like, I have to change this differently, or I need to look at this differently or whatever. But there were moments over the course of our relationship where I was basically paralyzed with fear. Like I didn't know what to do or how to make the best next step. And it felt like a lot of the steps were just stepping on eggshells. And honestly, there were some times where I was like, oh, fuck it, whatever. I'll let future me deal with that. And future me would look back and be like, motherfucker, just fucking deal with your problems. Figure it out, you know? And I would just keep pushing that off and pushing it off. And it happened for years. So even in 2020 or up to 2020, it happened all these years, and all the shit that happened in our marriage. I mean, man, that would be a whole separate conversation. But to give you a quick version, we had a lot of craziness happen in the first 4 or 5 years of marriage. She broke a foot. I was out of a couple jobs, started a company. We thought we were going to die in a couple car accidents, like it was craziness. I took over the management of a commercial and residential building. My aunt was completely psycho. We thought she was demon possessed at one point, and we were living in the same building as her. I had to lock her out. My tiny ass little ex-wife had to like put her finger in my aunt's face and like tell her to fuck off. And that's not who this woman was, but there was almost like a huge fight, and it was craziness. So just over the first couple of years, there was craziness, and still trying to understand, like, how do I manage this? How do I best support her? How do I best support myself? What the fuck? And just kind of kept brushing off some of the stuff that had happened from years before that. So fast forward to 2020. COVID hits. I'm My wife and I at that point lived in Florida, and we were in an awesome condo downtown St. Petersburg. It was a smaller condo, but it was me, her, and our 2 dogs. And when COVID hit, we didn't work at offices anymore. So we were just stuck in our condo, basically fucking staring at each other for the entire day, trying to do work or whatever. But we needed to have conversations. So it was great in some ways, the silver lining, right, of 2020, where we were able to work through a lot of things because I couldn't just push those things off that I had for years, where I went, I don't know what to do with it. Fuck it. Future me will deal with that. I got other problems to deal with. At that point, we had problems we had to deal with, and we had to work through it. So I even look at that moment where, and I'm tying a lot of this stuff together, or at least trying to, I had a relationship with my mom and dad because I have one actively. So in that moment, I remember calling both of them at separate times and being like, here's what's going on, or here's what I think is going on, or here's what I want to have happen, or, you know, whatever. And ultimately we were heading down the path toward getting a divorce. But because of the work that I had done my own, you know, with therapy, with coaching, with just going on my own time, shadow work, and, you know, going back to little me and sitting with little me and going through those tough situations and kind of watching those movies. I'd done a lot of that work. And in that moment, I really needed to kind of put that stuff to use. And that moment was basically a year and a half leading up to a divorce, because we had a lot of time where we talked about things, tried to make things work. And then ultimately it ran its course. But I say that like I just did, it just ran its course, because by the time it ended, honestly, man, it was beautiful, because I knew at the end of it, like our last project together was going to be getting a divorce, and we worked really well together on projects. So like I took more of the visionary side of it, and she took a lot of the tactical, like I would put together plans with her and we would do stuff. That's how we worked on things. So even when we got the divorce, it was like, all right, cool. Here's the vision of this thing. Here's how it's going to work. Here are the things we need to get done. What can you take? What can I take? And I remember telling her when we first decided that we were getting a divorce, I was like, look, I don't mean to come off cold. And if I do, I'm sorry. I'm telling you that now. But now I am in go at it mode and get it done mode. So if you need a couple days, you let me know. She was like, I need a couple days. I'm like, okay. And we lived in the same house. So I was like, you take your time. You know, we do need to go eat food at some point, like that sort of shit. Like, let's go get dinner or whatever. But even just working through that, it was interesting to see how the years that led up to it, we had great times, and we never really had crazy fights. Again, she just wouldn't allow that, because that's not how she operated, because of how she grew up, because she would get yelled at and all that stuff. So she would shut down. So I learned to look at it differently and respect it differently as well. You know, I don't think anybody should really have a love that they have and then just write the person off forever, because there's a bond there. Like, you were tied together in some sort of way. And I appreciate that we were able to have that sort of stuff. You know, obviously I didn't get married to get a divorce, but I didn't get a divorce to die. And I feel like in certain ways it's been kind of a rebirth and part of the journey that needed to happen because of all the shit that I've learned and I've kind of put to use. But it stretches that muscle of being able to put those things to use. And sometimes it's really fucking difficult, man. So look, I don't have kids, but I have gone through the difficulties of being the kid in that tough situation and being in a marriage where one doesn't want to have kids.
Yeah.
And having to kind of come to grips with that shit. Even now, as I'm 38 years old, I had a conversation with my mom recently where I was like, yo, I might not have any kids. Are you good with that? You good with not being a grandmom or whatever? She literally just laughed at me and said, calm down, Hefner. You'll be all right. You'll find someone. And I was like, oh, okay. You don't need to call me the Playboy man, but all right, fine. And then on the other side, having a conversation with my dad, literally like 2 weeks ago, he was like, oh, you're not going to have kids. And just said it sort of flippantly. And at first I was like, oh, well, damn, you just said that without really thinking about it. Just like it was a known fact. And he was like, nothing against you, but think about it, dude. You're almost 40. Do you want kids in your 40s? I'm like, I don't fucking know. I thought I wanted kids before. And I thought I was going to have kids when I was married, but I didn't. And in some ways, I'm really glad that I didn't, because the divorce could have been messy.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting how all that stuff kind of ties together, and being able to actually use the stuff that you learn. I know that we all have unique stories, but at the same point, like, there are certain situations that we can all kind of align on, or you have some similarities, like you with your dad and 13 years old. We have those similarities. People can look at things differently. They can take things differently. They can do things differently with them. And I think that's part of the life journey, is figuring out how you do those things and do the best that you can. Like, back to the beginning of this conversation, the best that you can in all those situations. But I guess one of my major takeaways from all of it, and something that I talk to my parents about now, is communication. Like, yeah, you probably didn't need to tell me all the bullshit as a kid, because some of the shit I wouldn't have gotten, like your mortgage payments or whatever. Like, I wouldn't have understood that as a kid, but it would have been great to be able to have conversations that were deeper, or that I felt like I could be open and have conversations. And it's interesting because they can remember that there were certain conversations that we had, but in some ways, maybe it wasn't enough, like I didn't feel like it was enough in those moments. But now I kind of capitalize on those when we have conversations, because that's honestly just the way I work and operate. Shit, it led me to being the host of a podcast called the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show. I mean, come on now.
Yeah. And, what a blessing to be, given that gift of your wife not being similar to your other, girlfriends who would react, and it gave you an opportunity to see that things could be done differently, and the communication was the key, and you guys were able to have a peaceful separation and be able to move forward. And like you said, I don't think there's a real need to become enemies. Once upon a time, you cared about each other, and unfortunately, some people just don't see that, and they're possibly still avoiding their own traumas, and like you're saying, the future me will deal with it, and what you resist persists, and it's going to keep chasing you until you decide to I'm gonna deal with this. And sometimes we get pushed to those moments of extreme pain where we don't have a choice, that we have to deal with it. But and is that what's led your life experience and so forth? Is this what's led you to work with men and the men group that you're a part of?
Yeah, it's interesting how life shows you different doors. It's up to us to be able to go through those doors or not go through them. So even when I look at my life over this year, and then my life over the last 2 years, a lot of things have changed. I was having a conversation with somebody about this last night. I was like, man, 2 years ago, I was married. I was fully into this one project that I was really working on, and like all of these things. And now I look at what I'm doing now, and even to be 50 plus episodes into the podcast and being able to have the opportunity to show others how to do it because of the shit that I've learned and gone through, which is what led me into coaching and working with different men.
Yeah.
I've worked with different women at different times, but honestly, I get men more than I do women. So I feel like I have more of a right to be able to talk about certain things, and I can understand where they're coming from and what they're going through. But all that has come from literally stacking these experiences and the thoughts and the tools and techniques and all that I've not only learned, but that I've been able to put into use. Because you and I can learn something, like you do these things in these steps, and it might work exactly how you want it to work. But sometimes you, as a person, need to uniquely shift things around a little bit. And that really comes from figuring out how do you best work. And same deal with clients I work with, men that are part of the Powerhouse Men Brotherhood, understanding how they best work with things and what their traumas are and what they've gone through. But honestly, man, I think a lot of that comes from intaking the information and filtering it and doing something with it. with my ex-wife when I was freaking out, and she was like, that's not going to work. That's not how this works. I could have been like, that's cool. Fuck you. And continued to yell or whatever.
Yeah.
Instead, I took that information, filtered it, and said, all right, well, how do I pivot from that? And that's just one moment. So there are many other moments, business moments, other relationships, tons of things that I can look at and go, I remember being in that spot where I was like, okay, I need to do something a little different. So what does this mean? What do I do from here? And being able to do something with it. So I think moral of the story almost is that communication. You got to be able to communicate with yourself before you can communicate with anybody else. And sometimes that takes talking with somebody else, like a coach or a therapist or somebody, to just be like, I don't know exactly how to say these things, but then to have them kind of help you along that way to be able to get that stuff out. Because I feel like there's a momentum that goes along with that. Once you start to do the work, and man, you get this. Once you start to do the work, you start to do it. It starts to open up things. It's also like tough fucking workouts where you're like, I don't really want to lift all this heavy weight, but I know I'm going to feel great kind of afterwards. And you lift all the heavy weight, you do all the things, and you're like, it's painful, but you know, it's a good pain instead of you tore up your body pain.
Yeah.
And I think as you feel more of that and you get more of that, you want to do more of that. But at the core of it, if you can't communicate with yourself and you can't communicate with anybody outside of you, then all that work that you do is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to do anything.
Absolutely. And, for me, the last 12 months has been a journey of really getting into the gym and, working on myself. And, I was seeing a therapist for, 7 years prior. And I was just like slowly peeling those layers back. And till the last 12 months is like just really diving deep. And like you're saying, it's a sense of freedom once you get to that place. And you realize that all that pain was worth all the effort. So Nick, where can people reach you and find you and get in touch with you?
Well, first off, Pat, thank you so much for having me on the show, man. It's always awesome talking to you. I appreciate the friendship that we're starting to form, and it's been in a short period of time. And it's so cool how technology is, because you are literally on the other side of the world.
Yes.
And we're having all the conversations and we're getting into this stuff. So I appreciate that there's that. And along those lines with the internet, the best way to be able to connect with me is nickmcgowan.com. So it's NickMcGowan.com. That'll allow you to connect with me. That'll also give you access to the podcast. And the podcast is the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show. So the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show.com. It's on iTunes or Apple, Spotify, basically everywhere. So just look up the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show. I'd suggest people check that out because we can connect, and I'm open to have a conversation. I'm taking 2 more one-on-one clients over the course of the rest of the year. No more outside of that, but I'm definitely down to have a conversation. But I'd suggest everybody go check out the show, because that's where the conversations are really being had. Those are the things we're getting into deep stuff about, like the conversation you and I had. And then from there, if there are certain specific things that people want to connect about, please, I'd love to connect. So again, nickmcgowan.com or the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show.com. And again, Pat, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Awesome. And I appreciate your, vulnerability and openness to discuss, the things that you've experienced in your life. And I know it will add a lot of value to, to everyone out there. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. So thanks again. And guys, I hope you've taken a lot away from this episode. As I know I've learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.